Welcome to Restory Nights, where history helps you fall asleep. In a world where arranged marriages were the norm and superstition ruled every corner, medieval brides faced their wedding nights with quiet fear. Alone in unfamiliar rooms, with expectations weighing heavily upon them, these women stepped into a night of uncertainty, courage, and whispered secrets that history rarely remembers.
The drone of the wedding feast that long since faded into a dull ache behind Ilara's temples. Laughter, thick with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine, still echoed in the great hall, but here, in the narrow stone corridor, the only sounds were the soft scuff of her slippers and the heavy, rhythmic beat of her own heart. The air grew colder with every step, seeping through the fine wool of her gown, a gown that felt less like a bride's adornment and more like a ceremonial shroud. At 17, Ilara had understood her purpose for as long as she could remember. She was a daughter of House Greymont, a piece on a map, a signature on a treaty sealed not with ink, but with her own body. Her marriage to Lord Alaric of Blackwood was a necessary alliance, a strategic bridge between two powerful but wary families. Her father had explained it to her with the same dispassionate tone he used when discussing crop yields or fortifications. "He is a good man," her father had said, his eyes fixed on some distant point over her shoulder. "Strong, honorable. He will protect our interests." He had not mentioned love or kindness or even companionship. Such things were luxuries, fragile blossoms ill-suited to the stony ground of political necessity. The ceremony itself had been a blur of incense, Latin chants, and the press of unfamiliar faces. She had stood beside Lord Alaric, a man she had met only twice before, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as the castle walls around them. He was older, perhaps 30, with a jaw that seemed carved from granite and eyes the color of a winter storm. He had spoken his vows in a clear, strong voice that carried through the cavernous chapel, while hers had been a whispered breath, nearly lost in the vastness of the space. Now her mother's hand was a firm, cool pressure on her arm, guiding her away from the fading warmth of the feast and toward the unknown dark of the bridal chamber. "You remember what you must do," her mother said, her voice low and urgent, not a question, but a command. It was the same tone she used with the servants when a task was not performed to her satisfaction. Ilara nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering torchlight that threw long, dancing shadows on the walls. Of course she remembered. The lesson had been drilled into her for years, not in explicit detail, but in 1,000 subtle ways, in the hushed warnings of her governess, the knowing glances of the older ladies in waiting, and the cold, pragmatic instructions from her mother. Her duty was to be compliant, to accept her husband, to welcome him into the marriage bed, and to pray that their union would be blessed with a son before the next harvest. An heir would cement the alliance. An heir would prove her worth. "There will be discomfort," her mother continued, her grip tightening slightly. "That is the price of womanhood. You will endure it with the grace and silence befitting your station. There must be no tears, no fear. You are a Greymont. Show him your strength." Strength. The word felt like a cruel joke. Ilara felt anything but strong. A cold dread had taken root in her belly, its icy tendrils spreading through her limbs, leaving her hands and feet numb. This night was not a celebration of love, but the final, irrevocable act of a transaction. She was the payment, and the debt was her family's security. The pressure of it was a physical weight, settling upon her shoulders, making it difficult to draw a full breath. This anxiety, she knew, would not fade with the morning sun. It was a new companion, one that would likely sleep beside her for the rest of her life, long after the ceremony itself was a distant memory. They reached a heavy oak door, banded with iron. This was it, the bridal chamber, her new room, his room. Her mother paused, turning her to face her. In the wavering light, her mother's face was a mask of stern resolve. "Your father and I have done our part. Now you must do yours. Do not fail us." She gave Ilara's arm a final sharp squeeze before nodding to the guards, who pulled the heavy door open. The room was vast and filled with shadows. A fire crackled in a great stone hearth, casting a warm golden glow on a massive four-poster bed, its dark curtains drawn like a stage awaiting its final act. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and something else, a faint masculine scent of leather and steel that was undeniably Lord Alaric's. Her ladies-in-waiting, two young girls with nervous, averted eyes, were already there. They moved around her in a practiced silent ballet of efficiency, untying the laces of her heavy gown, unpinning the intricate braids of her hair, and helping her into a simple, unadorned chemise of fine white linen. The fabric felt impossibly thin, a fragile barrier against the cold air and the colder expectations of the night. Every touch, however gentle, made her flinch. Their silence was worse than any words could have been. It was a silence filled with pity and a shared, unspoken understanding of her fate. They knew what this night meant. They knew the burden she carried. Once she was ready, they curtsied and slipped out of the room, their departure as quiet as their arrival. The latch of the door clicked shut with a sound of utter finality, a sound that locked her into this new life. Alone, Ilara felt the full force of her fear. She walked to the hearth, holding her trembling hands out to the flames, though their heat could not touch the chill deep within her bones. She was a stranger in a stranger's room, waiting for a stranger to come and claim her. She knew nothing of this man, Alaric, beyond his name, his title, and his reputation as a fearsome warrior. Was he cruel? Was he gentle? The uncertainty was a torment, a dark chasm of possibilities that her mind could not help but explore. The pressure to perform, to fulfill her duty flawlessly, was immense. This was not merely a personal matter between a husband and wife. It was a public and political act. The consummation of the marriage was a seal upon the alliance, and until it was done, the pact was incomplete. She imagined her father and his advisers waiting, her mother sitting stiffly in her chambers, all of them anticipating the morning, when the proof of the night's success would be discreetly displayed. The honor of her family rested on her ability to endure this night, to be the placid, obedient vessel they had raised her to be. A noise in the corridor made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. Heavy footsteps approached. The door handle turned. Lord Alaric entered, closing the door softly behind him. He seemed to fill the room, his broad shoulders eclipsing the firelight. He had shed his formal tunic for a simpler shirt, but he still looked formidable, a man more at home on a battlefield than in a bedchamber. He did not speak, his stormy eyes assessing her from across the room. Ilara stood frozen by the fire, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could hear the crackle of the logs, the rush of blood in my ears. I waited for him to cross the room, to take me, to complete the duty that tradition demanded of them both. The anxiety was a physical thing now, a knot of ice in my stomach, making me feel faint. This was the moment my entire life had been leading toward. Not a beginning of love, but the quiet, lonely end of my girlhood. This was the burden of tradition, and it was mine to carry, alone, into the long and silent night.
As Lord Alaric closed the heavy oak door, the click of the latch echoed in the cavernous silence, sealing them inside. He was a mountain of a man, and the flickering firelight carved deep shadows across his face, turning the hard lines of his jaw and brow into something altogether more menacing. To Ilara, standing frozen by the hearth, the room was not empty. It was crowded with unseen things, malevolent spirits drawn to the momentous, vulnerable occasion of a wedding night. Her childhood had been steeped in the whispers of such entities. Old Nan, her nursemaid, had a story for every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind that rattled the castle stones. Her world was not governed by lords and ladies alone, but by a far older, darker court of specters and omens. Villages whispered of curses laid by a jealous glance, of night hags that soured the milk and stole the breath of newborns, of restless spirits that clung to ancient families, demanding their due. And a bride, Nan had warned, was a shining beacon for such forces, a vessel of potential life, standing on the threshold between two worlds, her maidenhood and her marriage. She was open, vulnerable, and a tempting target for any dark thing that might wish to curdle the union before it had truly begun. Every shadow in the chamber seemed to hide one of these warnings. The tapestry on the far wall depicting a grim hunting scene seemed to writhe in the firelight. The fangs of the embroidered hounds looked unnervingly real. A sudden draft snaked across the floor, cold and sharp, and Ilara's breath hitched. Old Nan had called such drafts corpse winds, the passing of a spirit. She instinctively curled her toes inside her thin slippers, away from the cold touch of the stone. Alaric moved, and the spell of her paralysis was broken by a fresh wave of fear. He walked not to her, but to a small table where a decanter of deep red wine and 2 silver goblets sat waiting. He moved with a warrior's economy, no wasted steps, his presence filling the room and shrinking it around her. As he poured the wine, the liquid gurgled, a low, thick sound in the quiet. Ilara's eyes darted to the window. Earlier, as her ladies had prepared her, an owl had hooted from the battlements, a low, mournful call that had sent a shiver down her spine. A bad omen, a warning of sorrow. The wind howled softly now, a lonely counterpoint to the crackling fire. It sounded like a woman weeping. "You are cold." Alaric's voice was a low rumble, a statement, not a question. He turned, one goblet in his hand, and the shadows shifted once more. Ilara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She was cold, but not from the air. It was a chill that came from within, a deep primal fear fed by a lifetime of stories. She remembered Nan telling her of Lady Seraphina, a bride from 2 generations past, who had supposedly been barren. The whispers said her husband's rival had paid a crone to curse the marriage bed, to place a twisted, barren root beneath the mattress. They never had a child, and the Lord's line had ended with him. Was this bed cursed? Had a servant with a grudge, a villager with a grievance, or a political enemy of her father's done something to jeopardize this union? The great 4-poster bed, with its heavy, drawn curtains, was the center of the room, the altar for the night's ritual. It was also, in her mind, the most dangerous place on earth. The darkness within those curtains was absolute, a perfect hiding place for any entity that had been summoned. Alaric took a slow sip of his wine, his gaze never leaving her. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were impossible to read. Was he looking at her, or at the space just over her shoulder? Did he sense the spirits, too? Men, she knew, were often blind to such things. They saw the world as stone and steel, of battles won and lost.
They did not see the thin places, the veiled warnings that governed the lives of women. "My lady," he said, his voice still a gravelly murmur, "the hour is late." It was a command, gentle but unmistakable. He wanted her to come to the bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She took a hesitant step away from the fire, the slight movement feeling like a monumental effort. Her mind raced, cataloging all the things that could go wrong, all the spectral dangers she had been taught to fear. Had she inadvertently slighted a household spirit by not leaving an offering of milk? Had she failed to wear the sprig of protective rowan her maid had tried to press into her hand? In her nervousness before the ceremony, she had forgotten it. The omission now felt like a fatal error. She imagined a gaunt, cold hand reaching out from under the bed to grasp her ankle. She envisioned a whispering voice coiling out from the shadows behind the curtains, a voice only she could hear, promising a loveless marriage and a barren womb. These were not childish fancies. They were real and potent threats, as solid in her mind as the stone floor beneath her feet. The superstition, this ingrained terror of the unseen, made the already daunting prospect of the night feel impossible. She was not just facing a stranger in Lord Alaric. She was facing a legion of phantoms, each one a testament to the fragility of happiness and the ever-present threat of ruin. Her gaze fell on the small iron poker resting by the hearth. Iron, Nan had always said. The cold iron wards off the fair folk and lesser demons. For a wild moment, she considered seizing it, holding it before her like a cross. The absurdity of the image stopped her. She was the Lady of Blackwood now, not a terrified peasant girl. Her fears were a luxury she could not afford to show. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Ilara forced her feet to move. She crossed the room, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet her husband's gaze. As she neared the bed, she could feel the pull of its shadowed interior, a vortex of unknown dread. The superstitions that had been her companions for so long were now her tormentors. They made the unfamiliarity of her husband's body secondary to the terror of the unseen bodies she felt were already in the room with them, watching, waiting, judging. She stopped beside the bed, her hands twisting the fabric of her chemise. She waited. Alaric placed his goblet down with a soft metallic ring. He walked toward her, and the final few feet of space between them disappeared. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the wine on his breath. He reached out, not to touch her, but to pull back the heavy velvet curtain of the bed. The interior was dark, lit only by the distant fire. No monster leaped out, no whispering voice spoke. There was only the bed, neatly made, with pillows plumped, and a heavy fur blanket turned down, ready. It was just a bed. And yet as she climbed into it, the sheets cool against her skin, she could not shake the feeling of being watched. She could not silence the litany of old Nan's warnings in her head. The night was young, and the shadows were long. The real test, she knew, was not of her body, but of her spirit against the dark forces that superstition had made so terrifyingly real. The heavy velvet curtain fell, plunging the bed into a deeper, more intimate darkness. The world shrank to the space of the mattress, the scent of lavender from the linens, and the overwhelming presence of the man beside her. Lord Alaric was a wall of heat and solid muscle, and as he settled onto the bed, the mattress dipped significantly, pulling Ilara's smaller frame toward him. She instinctively stiffened, pulling herself to the very edge of her side, as if a few inches of wool and linen could form a meaningful barrier. Her fear of curses and spirits, so potent only moments before, now seemed a distant, almost foolish thing. The terror that gripped her now was immediate, physical, and utterly bewildering. It was the fear of the unknown body. Ilara's education in such matters had been a masterpiece of deliberate omission. It was a subject shrouded in a silence so profound it was louder than any words. Her mother had spoken of duty and endurance. Her governess had once explained the cycles of the moon and their connection to a woman's body with the clinical detachment of a botanist describing a plant. But the lesson had stopped abruptly before explaining its ultimate purpose. The other girls at court whispered, their stories a garbled mix of farmhouse crudity and wild fantasy, speaking of pain and blood and a strange, violent submission. None of it had formed a coherent picture. It was a mosaic of frightening fragments, offering no map for the territory she was about to enter. Her own body was a landscape she barely recognized. She knew its shape beneath her chemise, the slope of her shoulders, the curve of her waist, but of its inner workings, its capacity for feeling beyond simple pain or comfort, she knew nothing. It was a vessel, she had been taught, a coffer that would hopefully carry the Greymont line forward, joined with the Blackwoods. She was the lock, and he, her husband, was the key. But the mechanics of how a key turned in a lock were a terrifying mystery. Alaric shifted, and his arm brushed against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her that was pure panic. His skin, even through the fabric of his shirt, felt rough, hot, and alien. Men's bodies were different. She had seen them in statues of ancient heroes and in the anatomical drawings of monks, all muscle and sinew, hard angles and strange proportions. They were built for war, for labor, for a world of action and violence that was entirely separate from her own. To have such a body here, in this confined and intimate space, felt like a fundamental violation of the natural order. He shifted again, and this time with purpose, sitting up to pull his shirt over his head. In the dim, flickering light from the fire, she caught a glimpse of his torso. It was broader than she could have imagined, a landscape of hard muscle, dusted with dark hair. A long, pale scar cut a diagonal line across his ribs, a relic of some battle she could not picture. It was a map of a life she did not know, a testament to a violence he carried within him. The sight was not beautiful or enticing, it was terrifying. It was the body of a predator, and she was trapped beside it. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face toward the cold outer wall of the bed. She wished she could make herself smaller, dissolve into the bedding, become nothing more than a wrinkle in the sheets. Every nerve in her body was screaming. This was not natural. This was a strange, frightening ritual, and she had forgotten all the steps. Was she supposed to speak, to move, to lie perfectly still? The weight of her ignorance was crushing, making her feel clumsy and stupid. She felt his weight shift again as he lay back down. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Why didn't he speak? Did he expect me to initiate something? The thought was so absurd it was nearly hysterical. A moment later, a hand, large and calloused, settled on her waist. Ilara went rigid. She stopped breathing. The hand did not move, but its weight was immense, a brand of ownership against the thin linen of her chemise. This was it. This was the beginning of the discomfort her mother had promised. She tried to remember her mother's other words, endure it with grace and silence. She forced her lungs to draw a shaky breath, her body remaining as still as a cornered fawn. The hand moved slowly, stroking down her side from her ribs to her hip. The touch was not rough, but it was so foreign that her mind struggled to process it. It was like being touched by a creature from another world. He was learning the shape of her, a shape he had purchased in a marriage contract. She felt like an object, a piece of property being inspected by its new owner. When he began to push the hem of her chemise up, a fresh wave of cold panic washed over her. To be uncovered, to be seen in her nakedness by this stranger, felt like being stripped of the last layer of her identity. But she did not resist. Resistance was not an option. A bride's duty was to yield. The experience that followed was not a union, but a collision. It was a fumbling, confusing sequence of movements in the dark that she could neither comprehend nor anticipate. His body, heavy and powerful, covered hers. She felt trapped, pinned beneath a weight she could not hope to move. The unfamiliarity of it all was overwhelming. The scratch of his beard against her cheek, the strange guttural sounds of his breathing, the blunt force of his actions. There was pain, a sharp tearing sensation that made her gasp, and she bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. No tears, her mother had commanded. Show him your strength. But this was not strength. It was a hollow, desperate endurance. She detached her mind from her body, a trick she had learned as a child during long, dreary lessons. She mentally floated up to the canopy of the bed, looking down on the two entangled figures below. She saw a frightened girl and a determined man, both performing a duty prescribed by centuries of tradition. She felt nothing but the pain, the pressure, and a profound, soul-deep confusion. This was the great mystery of marriage, the act that poets wrote of and singers sang about. It was nothing but a clumsy, painful struggle in the dark. It was biology at its most basic, stripped of all tenderness, all emotion, all understanding. It was overwhelming because it was meaningless, a physical act completely disconnected from any feeling other than fear. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. His weight lifted from her. He moved away, rolling onto his back with a heavy sigh. The space between them in the bed felt like a vast, empty chasm. The silence that rushed back in was different now, heavier, filled with the echo of what had just happened. Ilara lay perfectly still, her face still turned away. A dull ache throbbed between her legs, a painful reminder of her body's new reality. She was no longer a maiden. She had done her duty. She had not cried out. She had not failed. But she felt no sense of accomplishment, only a hollow, aching emptiness. Her body, this strange and unknown vessel, had been used for its purpose, and she now felt utterly alien within her own skin. She listened to the sound of her husband's breathing as it deepened and evened out into the slow, rhythmic cadence of sleep. He was already gone, lost to a world of dreams, leaving her alone in the dark, with the terrifying, bewildering knowledge of what had passed between them.
The darkness in the bridal chamber was absolute, a thick, smothering blanket that offered no comfort. Lord Alaric slept beside her, the stranger whose breathing was the only sound in the vast, silent room. For Alara, sleep was an impossible dream. The sharp physical pain of the consummation had subsided into a dull, persistent ache, but that was a minor torment. A far greater weight, a pressure more profound than her husband's body had been, was settling upon her. It was the crushing expectation of fertility. As she lay stiffly on her side, a hand instinctively strayed to her flat stomach. It was a gesture of both desperate hope and abject fear. Society, in its unwavering and brutal simplicity, measured a woman's worth by a single cruel metric: her ability to bear children, preferably sons. A woman was a vessel, a field to be plowed and sown. Her mind, her spirit, her kindness, these were pleasant but ultimately trivial qualities. Her true value lay in her womb. A fruitful womb brought honor, security, and power. A barren one brought only shame, pity, and the constant gnawing threat of being set aside. This night, this ritual of consummation was not an act of love or even intimacy. It was a test. It was the first, most crucial examination in a lifelong trial, and the verdict would be delivered not by a judge or a priest, but by the silent, mysterious workings of her own body. The immense stress of it turned the marriage bed into a tribunal. Had it worked? Had the seed taken root? This single question would now dominate every waking moment of her life. Alara's mind replayed the words of the abbess who had tutored her in the womanly arts. The old woman, with eyes as pale and cool as a winter sky, had spoken of a woman's body as a garden bestowed by God. "You must tend it carefully, my child," she had said, her voice dry as rustling leaves. "For a garden that bears no fruit is an offense to the Lord and a disappointment to your husband. It is a useless plot of land, fit only to be salted and abandoned." The metaphor had terrified her then, and it terrified her now. She pictured herself as a barren field, a fruitless tree in her husband's orchard, standing stark and useless against the changing seasons. Her marriage was an alliance, a delicate bridge of diplomacy and power, but the foundation of that bridge was not stone or steel. It was the promise of an heir. A son would cement the bond between House Greymont and House Blackwood, weaving their bloodlines into a single unbreakable cord. A son would secure her position here, in this formidable castle, transforming her from a foreign bride into the respected mother of the future lord. Without a child, she was disposable. The pressure was not just political, it was deeply personal and public. She knew that from the moment the sun rose, she would be watched. Every woman in the castle, from the highest lady-in-waiting to the lowliest scullery maid, would be observing her. They would be counting the days, watching for the first signs of a thickening waist, for a telltale bout of morning sickness. Their whispers in the corridors would be a constant humming reminder of her duty. Every month that her blood flowed, it would be a public failure, a fresh announcement to the entire household that she had once again proven barren. This turning of the night into a quiet test of courage and composure was the true trial. The physical act itself had been a fleeting, painful ordeal, but this waiting, this hoping, this dreading, was a far more exquisite form of torture. It required a different kind of bravery. It demanded a mask of serene composure, a calm facade that betrayed none of the desperate anxiety churning within her. She had to navigate her days with grace, overseeing the household, smiling at her husband, all while the silent, screaming question echoed in her mind, "Am I with child?" She shifted slightly, the fine linen of the sheets whispering against her skin. Alaric did not stir. She looked at the faint outline of his broad back. What were his thoughts on the matter? Had her father spoken to him of her good breeding as if she were a prized mare? Did he too see her as nothing more than a womb to carry his heir? He was a warrior and a lord. His legacy was everything. His name, his lands, his power, all of it was meaningless if it ended with him. He needed a son as much as she did, if not more. His expectation was a silent, heavy presence in the bed beside her. The first faint hint of dawn, a sliver of bruised gray light, began to creep through a gap in the heavy window curtains. The night was ending. The watch was over, and the watch was about to begin. Soon the serving women would come. They would enter with a practiced, unobtrusive deference, but their eyes would miss nothing. They would come to tend the fire, to bring warm water, and to perform the most significant ritual of the morning, to take the bed sheets. The blood on the sheets, proof of her lost virginity, was also proof of the consummation. It was a signal to the world that the first step in the great gamble of procreation had been taken. The women who collected that linen would look at her with a new understanding, their gazes a mixture of pity for the girl that she had been, an assessment of the woman she must now become. She was no longer just a bride. She was a potential mother, and her body was now a matter of public interest. Alara closed her eyes, gathering her strength. The courage required for this was not the bold, flashing courage of a knight on a battlefield. It was a quiet, internal fortitude, a resilience forged in silence and anxiety. It was the ability to rise from this bed, to face the knowing eyes of the servants, to walk through the castle with her head high lie, and live with the crushing weight of an entire dynasty resting on the hope of a life stirring within her. The physical ordeal of the night was over.
But as the gray light of morning filled the room, Alara understood with chilling clarity that her true trial, the long, lonely test of her fertility, had only just begun. Her worth was not her own, and her body was no longer a private thing. It was a promise to two houses, and the whole world was waiting to see if she would deliver.
The gray light of dawn seeped through the heavy curtains, slowly and reluctantly illuminating the room. It was a cold, unforgiving light that seemed to strip away the softening illusions of the night, leaving only stark reality. For Alara, lying perfectly still on the edge of the vast bed, that reality was the man sleeping beside her. He was her husband, and he was a complete stranger. She had been awake for hours, listening to the even, deep rhythm of his breathing, a sound as foreign to her as the cries of a desert bird. In the darkness, she could almost pretend he was just a shadow, a presence without form. But the morning light was stealing that fragile defense. It sketched the outline of his broad shoulders under the furs, the sharp angle of his jaw, the dark stubble that had already begun to shadow his face. Each detail was a fresh reminder of her profound ignorance. She knew his name, Lord Alaric of Blackwood. She knew his reputation as a fierce commander, a man whose will was as unbending as the iron portcullis of his castle. She had met him twice before the betrothal was finalized, and once on the day of their wedding. The encounters had been formal, brief, and utterly impersonal, filled with the stilted language of diplomacy. She knew the shape of his sigil, a black wolf on a field of gray, better than she knew the shape of his smile. She did not know if he even had one. Facing a stranger in such an intimate setting was a disorienting, terrifying experience. The act they had performed hours earlier, an act meant to signify the ultimate union, had only served to amplify the immense chasm between them. It had been a transaction in the dark, a collision of two bodies fulfilling a contract. There had been no shared glance, no whispered word of comfort, no moment of connection. His body had been a foreign country she was forced to enter without a map, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she was left stranded on its shores, more alone than ever before. The centuries of societal pressure weighed upon her, a physical force pressing down on her chest. She was his wife. She was the Lady of Blackwood. She was expected to know him, to please him, to manage his household, and to bear his children. But how could she do any of that when the man himself was a mystery? She did not know what pleased him or angered him. She did not know if he preferred wine or ale, if he enjoyed music, if he had a cruel streak or a hidden well of kindness. Each of these unknowns was a potential trap, a misstep that could lead to displeasure or worse, disdain. Her vulnerability was absolute. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the castle, a sign that the household was beginning to stir. The sound made Alaric shift in his sleep. He grunted, a low, rough sound, and rolled onto his back. Ilara's heart leapt into her throat, and she squeezed her eyes shut, feigning sleep. She could not bear to meet his gaze, not yet, not in this revealing morning light. To look into the eyes of the man who had claimed her body, while his soul remained a locked fortress, was a terror she was not yet ready to face. Through her eyelashes she watched him. He was still for a long moment, and then his eyes opened. They were not the stormy gray she remembered from the ceremony. In the soft light, they seemed darker, deeper. He stared at the canopy above him, his expression unreadable. His face, in repose, looked weary. The lines around his eyes and mouth seemed deeper than she remembered, carved not just by age, but by hardship. She saw the warrior then, the man who had likely seen more death than she had seen seasons. He sat up, pushing the heavy furs aside with an easy strength that made her flinch. The cold air hit her bare shoulders where her chemise had slipped, but she dared not move to cover herself. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his back to her. In the gray light, his body was a tapestry of old battles. The long, pale scar on his ribs was just one of many. A puckered, star-shaped mark marred one shoulder blade, and a network of finer, silvery lines crisscrossed his back. He was a man made of violence and duty, and she was the latest in a long line of his obligations. She watched him as he stood and walked to the basin of water left for him, splashing his face with a stoic indifference to the cold. He moved with a kind of brutal grace, every action efficient and devoid of softness. He was not a man of the court, accustomed to gentle living. He was a lord of the harsh northern borderlands, and his very presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room. When he turned, his eyes met hers. She had not been quick enough. Her pretense of sleep was shattered. The fear she felt was so sharp it was almost a physical blow. They looked at each other across the room, the space between them charged with a thick, awkward silence. He was a stranger, and she was a stranger. They were two isolated figures bound together by a vow, sharing the most intimate of spaces, yet separated by a lifetime of unshared experiences. He was the first to break the silence. "The servants will bring food and hot water." His voice was a low rumble, flat and devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact, no more intimate than if he were addressing his steward. There was no good morning, no inquiry as to how she had slept. There was only the practical, the necessary. Ilara could only manage a small, jerky nod. Her throat felt as if it were full of sand. He walked to the hearth and stirred the embers of the fire, coaxing a few weak flames back to life. He did not look at her again. The gesture, perhaps meant to be practical, felt like a dismissal. It was as if their moment of shared intimacy in the night had never happened. Or perhaps for him, it was so insignificant that it required no acknowledgement. He was a stranger who had performed a duty and was now moving on to the next task of his day. The vulnerability she felt was staggering. She was trapped, not just in this room, but in this life, with a man who was a locked book written in a language she could not read. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run back to the familiar halls of her father's castle. But she was the Lady of Blackwood now. This cold, imposing fortress was her home, and this cold, imposing stranger was her husband, her future, her entire world. A sharp rap on the door broke the tension. Alaric turned and called, "Enter." Two serving women came in, their eyes respectfully fixed on the floor. One carried a tray with bread, cheese, and a steaming pitcher, while the other brought buckets of hot water. They moved with a practiced silence, their deference a clear sign of their awe and perhaps fear of their lord. As they went about their tasks, pouring water into the basin and setting the tray on the table, Ilara felt a new kind of exposure. The bedroom was not a private space. It was a public stage, and she and Alaric were the principal actors. These servants, and by extension the whole castle, were the audience, watching and waiting. The knowledge only heightened her sense of isolation. She was trapped, not just in this room, but in this life, with a man who was a locked book, written in a language she could not read. After Lord Alaric left the chamber, a different kind of authority filled the space. It was a silent, feminine power, wielded by the two serving women who moved about the room with a solemn purpose that bordered on the ceremonial. Ilara, now sitting stiffly at the small wooden table, felt their presence as an intense, unblinking scrutiny. She understood that their tasks were not merely domestic, they were ritualistic. Every gesture was laden with meaning, every action part of a script written by generations of tradition. And the smallest deviation could, she had been taught, invite catastrophic misfortune. Her mother, a woman who placed faith in custom above all else, had spent countless hours drilling these rituals into her. The first morning is as important as the first night, she had instructed, her voice crisp and unyielding. It sets the precedent for your entire life as a wife. The household spirits are watching. The ancestors are watching. Do not give them a reason to find you wanting. Now those words echoed in Alara's mind, turning every simple act into a high-stakes performance. The pressure was immense, a tight band of anxiety around her chest. Failing to follow these customs was not just a social gaffe. It was seen as a direct invitation to bad luck, a tear in the fragile fabric of order that could allow curses, barrenness, and discord to seep into the marriage. The older of the two women, a stern-faced matron named Iona, approached the bed. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and deeply respectful, not of Ilara, but of the rite she was about to perform. She did not look at Ilara, yet Ilara felt as if the woman could see her very soul. The younger maid stood back, her hands clasped, a silent acolyte. This was the moment Ilara dreaded most, the ritual of the bedding. With meticulous care, Iona pulled back the heavy furs and blankets. Her eyes scanned the white linen sheet beneath, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Ilara's heart pounded against her ribs. She had done her duty, she knew, but was the proof sufficient? Was it as tradition demanded? She remembered hearing a horrifying story about a distant cousin whose marriage had been annulled, the bride sent home in disgrace because the proof on the sheets was deemed inadequate, a sign that the union had been unblessed, or worse, that the bride had not been a maiden. Iona located the small, dark stain that marked the consummation and the end of Ilara's girlhood. She paused, her head bowed for a moment as if in prayer. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. This most private, painful moment of her life was now a public spectacle, a piece of evidence to be examined and judged. Iona carefully, precisely folded the sheet, ensuring the proof was protected within its layers. She handled it with the reverence a priest would afford a holy relic. This cloth would be shown, discreetly, to Alaric's mother, and perhaps to a few other trusted women of the household. It was the seal on the contract, the final, undeniable word. Ilara forced herself to breathe. One test was over, but a dozen more remained. The younger maid brought her a bowl of warm, herb-scented water to wash. Ilara dipped her hands in, her movements jerky with nerves. She recalled another of her mother's warnings. You must wash your face first, then your hands. To wash your hands first is to wash away the blessings of the night. Her hands froze above the water. Had she already made a mistake? In her anxiety, she couldn't remember the correct order. The catastrophic weight of this tiny, seemingly insignificant choice felt paralyzing. She chose her face, splashing the warm water onto her skin, praying she had remembered correctly. Next came the dressing. The maids did not lay out one of her own gowns from her dowry chests. Instead, they brought a simple, dark blue woolen dress that belonged to the House of Blackwood. This, too, was ritual. By wearing her husband's colors, she was symbolically shedding her old identity and accepting her new one. As they laced the gown, Ilara kept her arms perfectly still, her posture erect. A bride who slumped on her first morning was said to bring a weak-willed heir. Then came the ritual of the hair. Her long, loose hair, the mark of a maiden, had to be plaited and pinned up in the severe, intricate style of a married woman. Iona took the comb, her touch firm and impersonal. As she began to braid, she remembered another fragment of lore. She must remain completely silent while her hair was being dressed for the first time. To speak was to invite gossip and lies into her marriage. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Ilara focused on a loose thread in the tapestry, biting the inside of her lip to keep from uttering even a small sigh. Even the simple act of eating was fraught with peril. The tray of food sat on the table, plain bread, hard cheese, a slice of apple. It was a bride's traditional first meal, simple, wholesome, and symbolic of a life without frivolous excess. She was to eat it alone. "You must eat every crumb," her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "To leave food is to signal to the spirits of the house that you find their provisions lacking, and they may blight your larders for it." Ilara took the small loaf of bread. Her stomach churned with anxiety, and she had no appetite. But she forced herself to take a bite, then another, chewing the dense, dry bread until her jaw ached. She thought of a prayer to the household guardians her governess had taught her, a silent plea for acceptance and protection. She recited it in her mind, hoping it was the right one, hoping it was enough. Every moment was a test of memory, of composure. Failing to perform these customs would not result in an immediate, overt punishment. It was far more insidious than that. If, in a year, she was still not with child, the whispers would begin. They would say she had offended the spirits on her first morning. If the harvest was poor, they would remember that she had hesitated before washing her face. These small, forgotten moments would be resurrected and examined, twisted into omens of her failure. The smallest mistake could become the seed of a catastrophic legacy. When Iona had finished pinning the last braid, she stepped back and gave a single curt nod. It was impossible to tell if it was a nod of approval or simple completion. The younger maid gathered the folded sheet and the basin of used water. They curtsied, their movements synchronized, and left the room, leaving Ilara alone once more. She stood and walked to the narrow window, looking out over the misty courtyard. She had survived the night, and she had survived the morning's gauntlet of rituals. She had not screamed, she had not wept, and she had tried her best to honor every tradition, yet she felt no relief. The pressure had not lifted. It had simply woven itself into the fabric of her new life. She was the Lady of Blackwood, but her position felt precarious, balanced on a knife's edge of superstition and custom. From this day forward, every gesture would be watched, every action weighed, a constant, quiet test of her ability to navigate the treacherous currents of tradition. And the fear of making a mistake, of bringing misfortune down upon this house and upon herself, would be her silent, constant companion. The great oaken door to the bedchamber closed with a heavy, definitive thud, but the sound did not bring Ilara a sense of privacy. Instead, it seemed to amplify the silence, making the space feel less like a sanctuary and more like a stage. She knew, with a certainty that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end, that she was not truly alone. Just beyond the door, in the antechamber, her mother would be waiting. Her father, Lord Greymont, would be in the solar below, ostensibly sharing a final cup of wine with his new son-in-law's most trusted men, but his thoughts, she was certain, would be here. Her entire family, though unseen, was a palpable presence, their collective expectations, a heavy cloak settling over her shoulders. This night was not merely her own personal trial, it was a public performance for which her family was the primary and most critical audience. Her behavior, her courage, and her ultimate submission were not just personal concerns. They were a direct reflection on the honor of House Greymont. Every lesson in composure, every admonition to be silent and graceful had been leading to this moment. She was their creation, their ambassador, and her performance tonight would be the ultimate measure of their success. As her ladies-in-waiting began the silent, practiced ritual of undressing her, Ilara's senses were stretched to an almost painful degree. She listened for every sound from the corridor, the low murmur of male voices from below, the scrape of a guard's boot on the stone floor, the distant, muffled laughter from the dregs of the feast. Each sound was a reminder of the world just outside, a world that was waiting, watching, and judging. She thought of her mother, Lady Anya. Her mother's hand on her arm as she had led her from the great hall had been unyielding as a manacle. Her eyes, cool and appraising, had offered no warmth, no maternal comfort, only a final, silent command. Do not fail. Failure was not an option. To show fear would be to suggest her mother had raised a coward. To weep would be to suggest her family was weak. To resist her husband would be an insult of such magnitude that it could fracture the fragile new alliance before it had even set. The honor of her lineage, her father's political ambitions, and her family's standing all rested on her ability to be brave and compliant in this room. The tension was a silent, suffocating thing. Her ladies, two young cousins who had grown up with her, would not meet her eyes. They too understood the weight of this night. Their movements were quick and efficient, but their hands trembled slightly as they unlaced her gown. They were part of the audience as well, junior members of the watchful family, and they would be expected to report on her composure. Had she been pale? Had she trembled? Had she spoken of her fears? Their loyalty was to the family first, and Ilara knew that any sign of weakness would be dutifully noted. Once she was in her thin chemise, they curtsied and backed out of the room, their faces pale and serious. The door closed again, and this time the silence was absolute. Ilara stood alone in the center of the vast room, feeling infinitesimally small. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light throwing long, dancing shadows that seemed like spectral observers. She felt pinned in place by the force of her family's expectations. She could picture them so clearly. Her mother, sitting ramrod straight in a high-backed chair in the antechamber, her hands folded in her lap, her face a stoic mask. She would not sleep until one of the ladies-in-waiting brought her word that Lord Alaric had joined his bride. Her father, a man who rarely showed emotion, would be feigning a casual conversation, but his sharp eyes would be missing nothing, gauging the mood of the Blackwood men, waiting for the signal that the alliance had been physically and irrevocably sealed. Even her younger brother, only a boy, would understand the significance of the night. He would be puffed up with the importance of his family's new connection, and he would see her sacrifice as a necessary, noble act for their house. He would not understand her fear, only her duty. This collective watchfulness added a terrible, silent tension to the night. Her fear was not just her own, it was a potential source of shame for everyone she loved. Her bravery was not for herself, it was a gift she must give to her family, a final dowry of perfect, unwavering obedience. When she heard the heavy tread of footsteps approaching in the corridor, her heart seized. It was him, Lord Alaric, her husband. She instinctively clasped her hands before her, forcing them still to hide their trembling. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and composed her face into a mask of serene neutrality, an expression she had seen on her mother's face 1,000 times. She was a daughter of House Greymont. She would show them her strength. The door opened, and he entered. He was as formidable as she remembered, a stranger who now held her future and her family's honor in his hands. As he closed the door, she knew that this was it. The performance was beginning. The audience, though invisible, was holding its breath. Her mind raced, not with thoughts of the man before her, but with thoughts of her family. I hope my father is pleased with the alliance. I hope my mother will finally see me as a dutiful daughter. I pray that my composure will be enough, that my silent endurance will be seen as the courage they expect of me. The weight of their honor was a physical presence, pressing her down, demanding that she be flawless. She was not Ilara. She was a symbol. And in the silent, watchful eyes of her family, her personal fears and feelings were utterly, devastatingly irrelevant. The night would unfold, and she would play her part, not for herself and not even for her new husband, but for the unseen, expectant family lingering just beyond the door, whose honor was now her heaviest burden.
The hours that followed the consummation were a vast, uncharted wilderness of silence. Lord Alaric slept, a dark, unmoving shape in the bed beside her. But for Elara, sleep was an impossible chore. The ache between her legs was a dull, constant reminder of the night's transaction, a physical anchor to a reality she was still struggling to comprehend. Fear, cold and sharp, was still her companion, but as the night wore on, something else began to stir within her. It was not hope, nor was it defiance. It was a quieter, more resilient force, the subtle courage of endurance. This was not the bravery of songs and legends, the kind that wielded a sword or charged into battle. It was a woman's courage, an internal fortitude forged in the silent, unglamorous crucibles of duty and expectation. It was the strength she had been unknowingly cultivating her entire life, through every lesson in composure, every admonition to hide her feelings, every quiet moment of observing the uncomplaining resilience of her mother and the women around her. They were all survivors of this same quiet battle, and now it was her turn to take her place in their ranks. She lay perfectly still, her eyes open in the darkness and focused on her breathing. She breathed in the cool, unfamiliar air of the chamber and breathed out the tremor that threatened to consume her. In, out, a slow, measured rhythm. With each breath, she fought to reclaim the territory of her own body, not as a vessel of passion, but as a vessel of strength. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but she began to build a wall around it, brick by silent brick. She would not let it rule her. This was her new life. This formidable castle was her home. This sleeping stranger was her husband. These were immutable facts, as solid and unyielding as the stone walls around her. Fighting against them would be like a songbird dashing itself against a fortress. It would only break her. The only path forward was acceptance, and acceptance required a courage all its own. As the first faint hint of dawn painted a gray slash across the blackness, Ilara made a conscious decision. She would not be a victim in her own story. She would be the lady of this castle. She swung her legs out of the bed, her movements not hurried or fearful, but deliberate and calm. The cold of the stone floor against her bare feet was a shock, but she welcomed it, using the sensation to ground herself in the present moment. She walked to the basin of water left for her, the surface a dark, still mirror. She looked at her reflection, a pale, disheveled girl with wide, haunted eyes. She saw the fear there, but she also saw the flicker of something else, the unbending will of a Greymont. She picked up the pitcher of cold water
and poured it into the basin. The splash was loud in the silence, but it was a sound of her own making, a small act of control in a world where she had none. She washed her face, the icy water a bracing shock that chased away the last vestiges of sleepless misery. She did not weep. The time for tears was a luxury she did not have. Instead, she focused on the simple physical act, on the feeling of the cloth against her skin, on the scent of the soap. She was navigating this unknown territory, one small, composed step at a time. When she heard Alaric stir behind her, she did not freeze. She finished drying her face, folded the cloth neatly, and turned to face him. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands were steady at her sides. He was sitting up, watching her, his expression as unreadable as a weathered stone. The silence stretched between them, a fragile thread that could be snapped by a single wrong move. Ilara knew this was a critical moment. Her reaction now would set the tone for all their mornings to come. She could cower, avert her gaze, and affirm herself as a timid, frightened creature, or she could meet this moment with the composure her station demanded. Drawing on every ounce of her training, she gave a slight inclination of her head. "Good morrow, my lord," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was a quiet sound, little more than a whisper, but it was clear and steady. It was a measured word, a simple greeting that carried the weight of a monumental effort. In that small phrase, she was not just addressing her husband, she was asserting her own existence. She was here, she was his wife, and she would not be broken. Alaric's stern expression did not change, but a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, passed through his stormy eyes. He gave a curt nod in return. "My lady." It was a small exchange, almost nothing, but it was a beginning. She had navigated the first step on this treacherous new ground. When the serving women entered, Ilara was already standing by the fire, her back straight, her hands loosely clasped. She endured their knowing glances and their silent, pitying deference with a calm she did not feel. She watched as Iona performed the ritual of the bedding, her face a mask of placid neutrality. She felt the shame, the exposure, but she did not let it show. Her courage was a shield, invisible but strong, deflecting the subtle barbs of their curiosity. As they helped her dress in the dark blue gown of House Blackwood, she did not flinch from their touch. Her movements were fluid and graceful as she allowed them to braid and pin her hair. She was a statue of composure, a perfect portrait of a new bride settling into her role. She spoke to them when necessary, her voice calm and even, giving simple instructions about her dowry chests. Each calm movement, each measured word was a small victory against the terror that still coiled within her. This what quiet courage looked like. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function alongside it. It was the subtle resilience of a willow tree, bending in the storm but refusing to snap. It was the art of navigating the unknown, not with a map, but with a steady compass of inner resolve. Ilara knew her life would likely not be filled with joy or love, but she had survived the first night. She had faced the stranger in her bed, the expectations of her family, and the terror of her own ignorance, and she was still standing. Her strength would not be loud, but in the quiet corridors of Blackwood Castle, it would be enough.
Lord Alaric's breathing had long since deepened into the slow, rhythmic cadence of sleep. It was a steady, untroubled sound that filled the vast space between them, a sound that spoke of a duty completed, a conscience at peace. For Ilara, lying awake and rigid in the darkness, that sound was a form of torture. It was the only anchor in an ocean of absolute, crushing silence, a silence that was far from empty,
It was a living, breathing entity, and its weight was pressing down on her, suffocating her. Without guidance or reassurance, a bride was left to face her fears alone. Her mother's final words had been a command, not a comfort. Her ladies-in-waiting had offered only averted eyes and trembling hands. She had been led to the precipice of this new life and left to step into the abyss by herself. Now, in the aftermath, the silence was her only confidant, and it was a cruel one. The candle on the bedside table now burned low, sputtered in a pool of its own wax. Its flickering flame was the only movement in the room, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced on the tapestries and writhed in the corners. In the profound quiet, every tiny sound was amplified into a deafening roar. The hiss and pop of the dying embers in the hearth sounded like whispers. The soft sigh of the wind at the window sounded like a weeping woman. But the loudest sound of all was the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart against her ribs. It was a wild, trapped thing, and she was certain Alaric must be able to hear it, even in his sleep. Every thought in her mind was a shout. What happens now? The question echoed in the cavern of her skull, unanswered. She had been given a script that ended the moment her husband claimed her. The pages that followed were blank. Was she supposed to sleep? To lie awake? Was she to wake him in the morning, or wait for him to wake her? Each trivial question felt monumental, a potential misstep that could define their future. With no one to ask, no reassuring hand to squeeze, the uncertainty was a torment. She replayed the night's events, searching for some clue, some sign of what he thought, what he felt, but there was nothing. His actions were efficient, detached, a task performed with the same grim resolve he might bring to signing a decree or sentencing a prisoner. There had been no tenderness, but then again, there had been no overt cruelty. There had only been a profound, impersonal silence. This silence was a breeding ground for fear. Alone with her thoughts, her anxieties grew monstrous and unchecked. What if she had displeased him? Her ignorance of the marital act had made her clumsy, stiff, and unresponsive. Was that what he expected? Or did he desire a partner who was skilled, passionate? She had heard whispers at court of such women, but they were always spoken of with a mixture of awe and contempt. She had no frame of reference, no map for this new world. She was a traveler without a compass, lost in a land where she did not speak the language. The night felt endless. The sliver of moon she could see through a gap in the curtains seemed frozen in the sky, time itself having stalled in this silent, candlelit room. She tried to think of her home, of her mother and father, but the thought brought no comfort. They had sent her here for this exact purpose. They were not thinking of her fear. They were thinking of the security of the alliance. She was a pawn moved into position, and the pawn does not concern itself with the feelings of the player. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence amplified not just her fears, but her physical sensations. The dull ache in her body was a constant throbbing presence. The rough texture of the linen sheet felt like sandpaper against her skin. The pocket of cold air on her side of the bed felt like a chasm separating her from the heat of her husband's body, a physical manifestation of the emotional distance between them. She turned her head slightly on the pillow, her hair whispering against the fabric. She looked at the dark shape of her husband. Who was this man? She knew his name, his titles, his deeds in battle, but she did not know the man himself. Did he have fears? Did he ever feel doubt? Did he look at her and see a woman, or just a womb, a vessel for his legacy? The silence offered no answers. It only deepened the mystery, turning him into a formidable, unknowable stranger with whom she was now irrevocably bound. At some point in the long, dark corridor of the night, a profound sense of despair began to settle over her. This silence might not be for one night. It might be for all of them. Perhaps this was her marriage. Two strangers sharing a bed, their lives running in parallel but never truly touching, the space between them filled with a permanent, unbridgeable quiet. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. She had expected a life of duty, but she had not been prepared for a life of such profound loneliness. As the candle finally gave a last desperate flicker and died, plunging the room into near total darkness, Ilara did not cry. Her sorrow was too deep, too heavy for tears. It was a weight inside her, as real and as oppressive as the silence that filled the room. The night had stripped away everything from her, her name, her home, her girlhood, and left her with this heavy, suffocating quiet. It was the sound of her new life, and she knew with a chilling certainty that she would have to learn to survive in it, alone. The night was not just a passage of time, it was a destination, and she had arrived.
Years had passed. The stone walls of Blackwood Castle, once so cold and foreboding, were now simply home. The scent of wood smoke and beeswax was no longer the smell of a stranger's chamber, but the familiar perfume of her own life. Ilara, now a woman grown, the Lady of Blackwood, in truth as well as name, stood by the narrow arrow-slit window in her solar, looking down at the courtyard below. Her daughter, a spirited child of 5, with Alaric's stormy eyes and her own determined chin, was chasing a goose, her laughter a bright ringing sound that defied the grim gray stones. Watching her, Ilara felt a familiar echo of the past, a ghost of the girl she had once been. Though centuries have passed for those who would read her story, for Ilara, the memory of her wedding night was not a distant historical event. It was a part of her, a foundational layer of the woman she had become. The anxiety of that medieval bride, her own anxiety, was a reminder of the universal human experiences that time cannot erase. Fear, expectation, and courage are timeless threads woven into the lives of women in every age, and her story was but one quiet window into a life that history would seldom remember. She remembered the fear. It had been a living thing, a multifaceted beast with 1,000 different faces. There was the crushing weight of tradition, the cold, pragmatic reality of an arranged marriage where duty, not love, was the guiding star. She had been a treaty sealed in flesh, the pressure to uphold her family's honor so immense it had felt like a physical weight on her chest. Then there were the whispers of superstition, the shadows in the corner of the room that held curses and ill omens, making the darkness a place of tangible menace. She remembered the profound, bewildering terror of the unknown body, both hers and his. With no education, no gentle guidance, the natural act of intimacy had been a strange and overwhelming collision, a source of confusion and pain rather than connection. That fear had been inextricably linked to the immense expectation of fertility. Her worth, her very security in this new home, had rested on the silent, mysterious workings of her womb. The marriage bed was not a place of comfort, but a tribunal where her value as a woman would be judged, turning the night into a long, silent test of her fortitude. And at the center of it all was the stranger, her husband. Facing a man she barely knew in the most vulnerable of settings had heightened every fear, every feeling of isolation. She had been trapped with a man whose past was written in scars she couldn't read, and whose mind was a locked fortress. The strict, unforgiving pressure of rituals had governed her every move, making the smallest mistake feel like a potential catalyst for catastrophe. Hovering over it all was the invisible but ever-present watchfulness of their families, their honor hanging on her ability to display a courage she did not feel. The weight of that silence,
The endless lonely hours with no one to turn to for reassurance had amplified every fear, making the night feel like a lifetime. That night could have broken her. It broke many women, but it had not broken Ilara. Her survival had not come from a single act of defiance, but from 1,000 moments of quiet courage. Her strength had not been loud. It had been a subtle internal resilience. It was in the steadying of her own breath in the darkness. It was in the calm, measured words she had spoken to her husband on that first terrifying morning. It was in the composure she had maintained under the scrutiny of the serving women, and in her ability to navigate the complex, unwritten rules of her new life with her head held high. She had taken the fear, the expectation, and the loneliness, and she had forged them into a shield. Over the years, the silence between her and Alaric had not entirely disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer the empty, terrifying void of their wedding night. It had become a shared space, filled with the unspoken understanding of two people bound by duty, respect, and the quiet rhythm of a life lived together. The stranger had slowly become a man she knew. She learned the meaning of his moods, the rare, gruff signs of his approval, the fierce, protective loyalty he held for his family, a family that now included her and their children. Love, in the way the troubadours sang of it, was not part of their story, but a different kind of bond had formed, one built on shared responsibility and a hard-won mutual respect. He was the Lord of Blackwood, a warrior and a ruler, and she was his lady, a woman whose quiet strength was the silent, steady anchor of his household. Looking down at her daughter, so full of life and fire, Ilara felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. She would give her child what she had never had: knowledge. She would not be sent into her own marriage as a blindfolded sacrifice. She would be armed with an understanding of her own body, and with the assurance that her worth was not measured solely by her fertility. She would be taught the importance of that quiet inner courage, the legacy of strength passed down through generations of women who had endured. The great histories would remember Lord Alaric's battles, the treaties he signed, the lands he governed. They would not remember Lady Ilara's first night of fear. They would not record the silent battles she fought and won within the stone walls of her own bedchamber. History, so often, is the story of loud, violent strength. But the legacy of women like Ilara is a quieter, more enduring one. It is a legacy of fear met with resilience, of expectation met with composure, of silence met with an unbreakable inner will. Their stories, though seldom remembered, offer a profound and timeless window into the human condition, a testament to the fact that the most significant battles are often fought not on a field of war, but in the quiet, lonely chambers of the heart.